Well, welcome everybody. I was very pleased to see so many familiar names who are joining us today in the registrant list. And for those of you who I do not know, I'm very grateful that you have joined and I'm happy to meet you. In this webinar, we have 6 highly knowledgeable experts who are going to be speaking today, sharing their experiences and their perspectives with what is becoming an all too familiar situation across the world, which is increasingly extreme wildfire events resulting in catastrophic ecological and social consequences. And this webinar is the first in what will become a series of webinars where we will be featuring different international fire scientists, practitioners, and managers, and we will be discussing a range of topics related to fire science and ecology. We plan to host these approximately 4 times a year. And this webinar series is just one component of an initiative that we are very excited about and that we are in the process of launching, and it's called the Global Wildfire Collective. So before kicking off the webinar, I want to briefly explain what the Global Wildfire Collective is and what we are hoping to do with it. So as there we go. As I mentioned, there are many countries around the world that are experiencing profound impacts from altered fire regimes and increasingly extreme catastrophic fire events. Impacts are both ecological and social, as we'll be talking about today. And despite the fact that altered fire regimes and catastrophic wildfires are a global issue, scientific research and operational capacity to understand and to respond to these events has been disproportionately focused in certain regions of the world, largely in North America and in Europe, the so-called global north. And as a result, some of the countries that most need scientific research and capacity to be able to adapt to and recover from and understand what's happening in their regions do not have the funding. They do not have the opportunity to engage with or collaborate with the global wildfire community of practitioners and scientists. Yet, wildfire is a global issue and it is affecting all of us. And we here believe that we're all in it together. So this is the spirit in which we are launching the Global Wildfire Collective as a way to foster collaboration, as the slide says, among many different sectors to facilitate resilience in ecological systems and social systems from wildfire. And so our mission is to be both globally diverse, but also broadly interdisciplinary in our research and in our capacity building. So we want to use the best available science for different regions of the world to develop resilience and recovery strategies that can be balanced in a ways that maximize both social and ecological well-being. And now, we all know that wildfire research and management, they're relevant to such a huge and immense range of topics across many different scales, many different disciplines, but to be able to bring some focus to our work and to foster meaningful collaboration, we have defined 4 distinctive key pillars of concentration where we can organize our discussion and our activities and our partnerships. So I will briefly tell you what those are. The first 2 scientific pillars are more physical or biological in nature. The first one is wildfires and global change. So we know that fire regimes are being altered in different ways in different regions of the world for different reasons. And it is a function of a lot of different interacting global change agents. And so this is our first pillar of focus. The other one is focused on fire ecology and biodiversity. And this will be to facilitate increased understanding of the natural system, the ecological drivers and impacts of altered fire regimes and evolution and adaptation to wildfire from an ecological perspective. Our next 2 pillars are more human and applied in their focus. The first one is fire management and policy. So this will be looking at integrated fire management strategies, including firefighting operations, including vegetation management and other types of policy decisions, so that we can discover ways to have beneficial outcomes across diverse regions in the world. And then the next one is taking it down to a local or a community level, where the focus will be on building community resilience to wildfire in ways that can expand the adaptation of fire resilient strategies for all people. So the word equitable is a key component of this pillar. And despite the fact that the three words diversity, equity, and inclusion are now bad words in the US, they are good words to us. And this is a key part of this fourth pillar of our work. Try to fast forward this. Okay, so how are we going to accomplish this mission? We have three avenues that we have defined so far. The first one is something that we hope to have launched by the end of April, and it's going to be a discussion forum online. And it's going to be multilingual, so it will enable us to have science practitioners in different topics can discuss and have conversations together, talk about collaborations, funding opportunities, et cetera. And what's neat about it is that it will be multilingual. So it will automatically translate the conversations into your own language where you are. So this will allow us to talk to people with many different languages. The next one is a spatial data platform. So this is, it's called a gateway, the Global Wildfire Collective Gateway. And it is going to be hosted by our already existing platform that we call Databasin. And basically what this is, it's a repository of a wide range of wildfire-related data. So including not only observations of fire, but also a range of remotely sensed data, data about fire drivers, as well as different types of fire technology, different fire models. And it provides a light GIS, so to speak. So members can view maps within the framework of this gateway. They can manipulate them and they can work together. And what's neat about this gateway is that you can develop working collaborations within it that are private. So groups can come together from across the world, share spatial data and other types of data, look at it together, and before they're ready to share it with the rest of the world. And then finally, we are looking to do capacity building. We're going to be doing that through a combination of education and training activities and having different events through different partnerships. So an example of that is our next meeting that's coming up in May. Our first real capacity building endeavor is going to be focused on the Latin American Caribbean region. So we are having a group meeting in Bogota for a couple of days where we're bringing together a wide range of participants to talk about what are the main gaps in data, what are the gaps in science, and what do we need to be able to start building better resilience and understanding of wildfire in the Latin American Caribbean region. And after that, in the fall, we are hoping to take what we all learn and then provide a second event where we have training for communities and policymakers and scientists and whoever wants to be involved. We are starting to assemble a group of charter members. Charter members are those members who are helping us to define the vision and the mission and form the strategy for the Global Wildfire Collective. The first ones I want to mention are some folks who we have formed a very tight partnership with, and these are the Bomberos Voluntarios de Cali, Colombia, and they are a state-of-the-art wildfire training and also firefighting group who has very advanced facilities. They do training all across the Latin American region. And so we're coming together to try to bring science and operations into one framework so we can facilitate resilience. So we have 3 members from the Bomberos Voluntarios. We also have my co-founders who are the executive director of the Conservation Biology Institute, Robin Jones, as well as our senior advisor for global strategy, Carl Peet. And then we're starting to put together an interdisciplinary group of wildfire research scientists that we hope can be representative of diverse disciplines and also diverse regions in the world. Some of these folks you will see presenting today on our talk. And beyond the charter members, we also are going to have standard members of the Wildfire Collective, which hopefully includes all of you, who will be able to collaborate together and take advantage of the tools that we are starting to establish. And we're also building interinstitutional partnerships. These that you see on the screen are ones that we have sort of officially formed partnerships with so far. And we are looking for other sponsors as well so that we can hopefully fund and get this initiative up and going at a grand scale so that we can really have an impact on dealing with these global issues of wildfire. And with that, I also want to acknowledge there are a lot of other groups out there who are doing amazing work that have resources and that have webinars. And our objective is to hopefully partner with people and to complement those groups and what they're doing and to augment them, not to duplicate what anybody else is doing or to compete with somebody. And an example of that is the FAO has an amazing group called the Global Fire Management Hub. And so they're doing amazing work across the world with fire management. And we are we are planning to join them in June, where they're going to be having a plenary in Rome. And so without further ado, you have been introduced to the Global Wildfire Collective. And with that, I'm going to start our webinar. The webinar is going to be divided into 3 distinct sections. The first session, I can't say session and section. The first session is going to be our presentations. And what we're doing is we are discussing 3 of the most impactful recent wildfire events that have happened. We will be presenting them in chronological order. So we will be starting with Dr. Owen Price, who is at the University of Wollongong in Australia, and he will be talking about the fires of 2019 and 2020 in Australia. Following that, we'll have Dr. Alejandro Miranda. He's from the Universidad de la Frontera in Chile, and he will be talking about the Valparaíso fires that happened recently in 2004. And then we're going to have Dr. Jon Keeley, who is with the USGS, as well as being an adjunct professor at UC Los Angeles. And he will be talking about the recent fires that we've just had here in Los Angeles. And we afterwards will be having a panel of 3 more experts who I will introduce at that time. And they will be providing their perspectives and responses. And then after we have the respondents talk, we will open up the floor, which is when you as the audience will have an opportunity to ask questions of our speakers and panelists, as well as to just start discussing overall what your concerns are about wildfire and how it's changing our world. So let's see, I wanted to remind the speakers that to try to stay within 5 to 7 minutes so that we do have a lot of speakers today so that we can all have an opportunity to speak and get our voices heard. Is there anything else I need to remind you of? I think that's it. Other than there is, I think Robin mentioned there is a Q&A button on your screens, which is where you can enter your questions that we can address after everybody has had a chance to talk. So with that, I introduce to you Dr. Owen Price. And Owen, just give me a hands up when you're ready for me to switch the slide.
Okay. Thanks, Alex, and hello, everybody. I can't believe it's actually 5 years since these huge fire season in 2019-20. And I should say this is a very, very complicated story, so I'm going to give you a brief summary. And also, am I really talking about the data here is from New South Wales? As you can see on this map here, this is the area where the fires burnt. But there were extensive fires also in Victoria to the south and also in Queensland. But New South Wales was the most heavily affected. So there were 5 million hectares of forest burnt. Next slide. And you can see from this graph of the area by year that it was more than twice as large as the previous forest fire extent recorded. And the biggest fire of all was 550,000 hectares. There were 2,500 houses destroyed, and it was a very mixed outcome for biodiversity, but obviously, as you can imagine, mostly bad. Next, please. So this is the story of the impact on biodiversity. Now, this is a really, really complicated story, but Don Driscoll published this paper in Nature recently, and here was his attempt to do a meta-analysis. So he got 62 different published studies on the immediate impacts of the fires and tried to look at the effect size because they all have different methods. He was focusing on effect size. So what you can see in the central panel is a variety of responses. So most of the taxa are to the left of the line. That means that they had an overall negative outcome. But he's had to break this up into two bits, which is looking at the species or the taxa that did badly, or the species within the taxa that did badly, and which is up to the left, and those that did well to the right. And then on the bottom panel, you see the effects of those same things exposed to high severity fires. And basically what you can see is the overall effect is bad, high severity is worse, and mammals were the most badly affected. It looks pretty bad for mammals. Okay, so next, please. And then we'll look at houses. That's the subject of much of my research. This graph shows for those 2,500 houses that were destroyed, how close they were to essentially the bush, either forest or grassland, as mapped under the official mapping of hazardous land. And what this graph shows, it's a cumulative plot. So it shows that 80% of the houses that were lost were actually inside the bush, and then 95% of them were within 100 meters. So if you look at this map here, this is a typical affected community with a mixture of houses that were lost and were not lost. One of the main things to notice is there's nowhere in there that's very, very far from the forest. And I think it's important to notice that this is a very, very different story. We could find no evidence of like mass house-to-house spread, as I'm sure what Jon is going to talk about later that happened in California this year. And then the last one more. This is the plot for the smoke exposure during that fire season of the average for everybody in southeastern Australia. And you can see that the entire population of eastern Australia was affected by smoke exceedances on multiple days through that season. So it was astronomically worse smoke event than has ever been recorded. Next. So then Alex asked us to look at the drivers of impact. So we did a whole bunch of reports for the New South Wales inquiry where we looked at all these different drivers. First one. Next. Drought. So this is a map of satellite derived live fuel moisture. The thing to notice about this is most of these areas are the greens, sorry, not greens, reds. And what it's actually showing is that around November of 2019, large parts of the forests were at the driest live fuel moisture that had ever been recorded. Next. And then when you look at fire weather, this graph here shows by year the number of days where forest fire danger index, our common fire weather index, was greater than 25. And that shows that that year, 2019-20, was by far and away the most number of days at this high level. So it's not necessarily the individual day record was broken, but the number of days with bad fire weather was broken. And then this map, it shows you all the different fire progressions across the whole state in 3 different blocks. colored by their fire weather. So the dark red and the reds are the really, really bad fire weathers. And I just put this in to illustrate that while there was some catastrophic weather during some of these fires, a lot of them were burning under relatively mild conditions. And in fact, a lot of the house loss occurred under relatively mild conditions. Fuel. So this is a map of a sort of an estimated surface fuel across 4 different regions in New South Wales going back to 1990. There was a lot of talk in the media saying that lack of fuel management contributed to these fires. But what this shows is basically the fuel loads just prior to the big season were more or less the same as they'd been for the previous 30 years. So that probably was not a factor. Drought, definitely. Fire weather, definitely. Fuel management, no. There are a bunch of other factors that we could consider. It was really remarkable that the normal pattern where every 5 days or so there's a cycle of weather and you normally would get rain, this just didn't happen. So the fires just kept burning through the night and across many weeks. That was a big contributor. But then again, that's another weather thing. So it was basically a climate event. And then if we go to the next, response. So look, the first thing I would say, there were a series of national and state inquiries that tried to look into this and make recommendations. And each of the governments then had to do a formal response and say what they've actually done to respond. But I think the biggest take home from these fires was there's a wide public acceptance about climate change, because basically everyone accepted that climate change had a big role in these fires. And you don't see people really in Australia now who doubt this. There's a next graph. This is a paper that was published a couple of years. It's using simulation, but it's basically showing the fact that those collection of blobs on the left-hand side are showing that the actual relative risk, thanks to the fact that the fuels have been reduced by the fires, had gone down to about 0.65 compared to what it was before. And they projected that by now it would have recovered somewhat to getting back up to the level it was, which is the bar at 1. So we're basically on a trajectory to recovering the fuels, and we're more or less, I think, probably back at the level of risk that we were before the fires. Next slide, please. One of the other responses has been a big increase in the national air fleet. Another one, please. So, for example, the Royal Fire Service in New South Wales has bought some Chinook helicopters. And this graph just shows you the number of aircraft that have been recorded as dropping water on fires over those years. So it's not actually necessarily the number of aircraft in the fleet, but it's that graph would show a very similar picture. There's been a strong focus on cultural burning, because there's a sort of a realization that there's something wrong with our fuel management, and there's something wrong with trying to try and protect people from bushfire. And so all levels of government and the community are quite engaged with this idea of bringing back cultural burning, which is a prescribed burn treatment, but it's more mild, and it looks something more like what you can see on this picture. There is an awful lot of other stuff going on. So the various different governments have put money into research. So probably the biggest one is the Natural Hazard Research Australia, which gave $80 million. So I get a lot of my funding from that body. In New South Wales, and they've set up a new $8 million Natural Hazards Research Centre. I also get funding through that. And then the New South Wales chief scientist has a technology fund. So this is this idea that there are technological fixes to some of these problems, which, in a way I partially agree with. And all of this is in conjunction with the agencies themselves, who are trying to respond to the inquiry recommendations. So they've had big improvements, or some improvements, in their ability to detect fires. They put a lot of effort into trying to map risk, so which parts of the landscape and communities are more at risk. trying to tinker with their planning rules. There's a lot of investment in tech, communications tech, because communications, when a fire is active, comes with the community, especially becomes a really big problem if the towers go out, landlines go down, all these kinds of things. So look, this is a really, really complicated response, and it's hard to actually document whether any of the things that have, well, first of all, what the changes have been, and also whether they've been effective. But I think if you ask me for a general opinion, I'd say, is the risk lower now? And I would say a little bit. Thank you.
Sorry, I muted myself. Thank you, Owen, for that. We will now move on to discussion of the Valparaíso fires that happened in Chile in 2024 with Dr. Alejandro Miranda. So Alejandro, just let me know when to switch slides.
Okay, thank you, Alexandra. Well, I'm going with my colleague Mauro. We're going to tell you about the tragic story lived in the past year in a city named Valparaíso. This next. Well, this is Valparaíso. If you can see in the two pictures, we can see housing development and informal house development. We can see in the picture of the right a lot of vegetation with the houses, material not prepared for wildfire, no road for emergency vehicles, etc. Low amount of water to attack fire. And that image of Valparaíso hills is all around Valparaíso and all around wild and urban interface. Next, please. And also in Valparaíso and in the Mediterranean region of Chile, we are living a mega drought. It's about 12 or 13 years that has very stressed vegetation that is very dry. That could be one of the causes of this wildfire. Next, please. Well, you can see this is Valparaíso in the right, and all other the colors are fires from the 90s. That's fire scars. So maybe all around Valparaíso is already burned in any moment. Next, please. And there in this red box is where 2024 Valparaíso fires occurs. Next. Well, the chronology of the fire, I'm going to try to be fast here. We have 3 simultaneous ignition. That's about 2 or 3 hours difference. We start at 12 with an ignition occurring at 20 kilometers of the main cities. And already at 4, the fire behavior was characterized by a convection column and short and long range spotting. But at 5, between 5 and 6 of the afternoon, you can have, we leave a maximum fire spread of 7 kilometers per hour, and with a wind speed exceeding 15 kilometers per hour. That is very rare for this zone of the country. And in that hour, the fire, if you can see in the picture of the right, between 5 and 6, the fire reached these first dense populated areas, and at 8, you already have 31 separate fire spots. And so the national authorities deemed this fire as uncontrollable. All the fire has no possibility to be controlled. Next, please. Well, this is the main numbers. More than 1,000 medical attentions, more than 5,000 fire victims, and more than 134 human fatalities, and so on. More than 6,000 houses destroyed. And what that means, we have the worst wildland urban interface fire in Chile's history, but also the 5th deadly fire globally since the past century. Next, please. If you remember, I said that we have 3 or 4 focus or ignition point, and this is an ongoing investigation, legal investigation, and this fire was intentional. That's the first we know, and there's some mechanism to start these fires that they're already known. And the worst of this is they're ex-members of firefighters or organizations that are involved in fire combat. And why maybe they do this? Because of perverse incentives, opportunity for additional compensation through overtime hours, and investigation revealed that this practice has been relatively common in the recent years. So in the past year, it maybe also could be that way. And as they are fire behavior specialists, these individuals known exactly when do start the fire to be uncontrolled. Next, please. And this is a 1-minute video. This no, this doesn't start.
You want me to I'll go ahead and start it now.
1-minute video. This is from Valparaíso, and you can see that people is taking his car to go far from this house. And why we want to show you this video? Because of the capacity of people to respond that rapidly to one fire that spread at this velocity. So maybe in 30 seconds, all the scenario is changing. So nothing more. Thank you, Alexandra.
Thank you, Alejandro. Very interesting. And next we'll move to the fires that happened just a month or so ago in Los Angeles. And for that, we will have Dr. Jon Keeley from the USGS and from UCLA in California.
Thank you, Alex. I appreciate the invitation to participate. These events that we're going to talk about right now happened so recently, we don't have nearly the information that, for example, Owen was able to give on the Australian fires. A few important attributes about these fires. They occurred within Los Angeles County. They were ignited in wildland areas dominated by chaparral, shrublands, and very quickly they spread into densely populated urban environments. And ultimately, the fires that did the most damage, and as you can see here in this slide, In the Eaton fire in the northeastern part of Los Angeles, 9,000 structures were lost, 6,800 in the Palisades fire near the coast. So we lost a lot of structures, and this was primarily driven by winds that caused homes to ignite, which in turn ignited other homes. Overall, we can say that these fires were ultimately the result of three factors. One is when they occurred in early January of 2025, there had been a previous 9-month drought, and thus everything, including the homes, were extremely dry. They were accompanied by extreme Santa Ana winds, and these are winds that we get in this part of the world every autumn and winter, and they are typically on the order of maybe 40 to 50 mile per hour winds that blow from the interior off the coast. These winds were extremely severe, much more so than typically is the case. They were on the order of maybe 60 to 100 miles per hour, or 25 to 40 meters per second. So these winds were more extreme than typical. And then the third important factor is human ignitions. This occurred during a weather event that precludes natural lightning ignition. So some human error is involved in production of these big fire events. Now, in terms of understanding how unique these fires are, we have to just focus on the fact that there were a lot of people killed, something like a total of 29 people killed just between the Eaton and Palisades fire, and something on the order of 17,000 structures lost. This is very unique for Southern California. We don't typically have these sorts of catastrophic events in this part of the world. The question that is certainly important to understand is how unique were the fires themselves? And in general, what we can say is the fire events themselves were unusual, but they were by no means unique. We have had big fires driven by Santa Ana winds in the winter in the past. We've had fires that are particularly severe, and almost always they follow an extended period of drought. So this 9-month drought was not unique. Can I see the next slide, Alex? Here's an illustration of some of our biggest fires in the past, going back all the way to the late 1800s. The ones in red are ones driven by Santa Ana winds. But the important point to make here is this is the number of months prior to the fire that was considered drought conditions based on the Palmer Drought Severity Index. And basically, you can see that all our big fires are preceded by an extensive drought. And 9 months is by no means an unusual event in this part of the world. What was particularly unique in these fires was the loss of lives, as I already mentioned. And what's important to understand is we've had big fires like this in those mountain ranges in the past, but because of population growth, we haven't had nearly the number of homes and urban areas adjacent to them as we have today. In other words, population growth has resulted in expansion of the urban areas, making them adjacent to these extreme potentially flammable vegetation. Go ahead, next slide. In terms of how do we head off such events in the past, there are a lot of things that have been proposed. One of which is, well, we need to do more wildland vegetation management. We need to do prescription burning, which is something that receives a lot of attention in California. We have prescription burning programs that are going on in many of our forested landscapes throughout the state. Important thing, though, to understand is prescription burning in these forests is a very different treatment than prescription burning in chaparral. Prescription burning in forests simply burns the understory fuels, and the dominant vegetation remains. In chaparral, when we prescribe burn, we eliminate essentially all the living above ground vegetation, and that makes these landscapes very vulnerable to flooding and debris flows and losses of that sort. So we have to be particularly concerned about the use of prescription burning in this landscape. But the other factor that we need to consider is how important is prescription burning as a factor in controlling these catastrophic fires. And this is just an illustration of the past fire history. The areas around the Pacific Palisades fire. Pacific Palisades fire was right off the coast here. And the panel on the upper left shows fires that occurred from 1990 to 99, and then on the right is fires between 2000 and 2009. The important thing is these landscapes had not gone an extensive time without fire. Commonly, chaparral landscapes will go much longer without fire. And so they weren't necessarily extremely old landscapes. And we see the same thing when we look down at the bottom two panels, which is the landscapes above Altadena, which was the center of the Eaton fire. In 2009, this yellow perimeter here shows the station fire. So we had a relatively recent fire that was quite extensive. And then in addition, the one on the lower right shows in blue prescription burns, or not prescription burns, but recent fires that had happened in that landscape. And so the important point is these fuels were not unusually old, and therefore it raises a question as to how much good prescription burning might have done. But the other important thing, probably more than anything else, is that the wildland fuels didn't really contribute to the loss of structures and lives in these two fires. They contributed the embers that ignited structures, but once the structures were ignited, fires basically were carried by the fuels in the homes themselves. So this was truly an urban fire and not so much a wildland fire. In terms of what to do in terms of down the line, it's the feeling of a number of us who work in this area that the most important thing that we can do is to reduce ignitions because we get Santa Ana winds every autumn and winter on the order of maybe a dozen or 24 events each year. 3/4 of them never have a fire, and that's because nobody starts a fire. But when we do have an ignition, and in recent years, the ignitions have largely been due to power line failures that occurred during these extreme wind events, as well as arson. And so when we have those ignition events, that is really what is the ultimate factor driving these big fire events. And so what some of us have proposed is we need to maybe make prevention a prominent response to wildland fires in these landscapes. And the one suggestion is we maybe take a two-tier approach to fire prevention. The first tier being if it is a Santa Ana wind condition day, in other words, a red flag day, what the firefighters call it, we have to make fire prevention the top priority, and we need to approach totally eliminating any human ignitions during those red flag days. And then the second tier is the rest of the year when we have fires that are not nearly as potentially damaging. We need to consider fire prevention, but it doesn't necessarily have to have the same priority as fire prevention during red flag days. And I'll end there. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jon. We are now about to begin our response or panel session. And as a reminder, we are going to have 3 experts who are providing perspectives on these particular events as well as events in general from different perspectives. So we will have Dr. Stijn Hantson, who is a professor he's on the Faculty of Natural Sciences from Universidad del Rosario in Colombia, and he will be talking about ecology and post-fire recovery in these fires. After that, we'll have Dr. Susan Cutter, who is a professor focused on hazards, vulnerability, and resilience at the Institute at the University of South Carolina in the United States. And we'll finish up with Dr. Mauro González, who is at the Instituto de Conservación Biodiversidad at the Universidad Austral de Chile. So with that, I will move on to Dr. Hantson. And for all of my panelists, you are welcome to speak on whatever most strikes you the most. But as some guiding questions for each of you, I will read them aloud and then I'll go ahead and speak and you can tell me when you're finished. So in terms of the ecological perspective, I wanted to know, are the ecological influences or the impacts of these catastrophic events, or even on a broader scale, because ecological impacts tend to happen at a broader, longer term scale, sometimes through altered fire regimes. Are they similar across the events? Are they different? How do they vary across other regions? And is there a way that increased global coordination or collaboration could potentially improve outcomes? And what are the challenges? So I will mute myself and leave it up to Stijn to provide some thoughts.
Hey, yeah, thanks a lot. Yeah, I mean, it's it's a lot of things to talk about in general, but well, one of the things, and like I'm gonna take a bit more of a global perspective, maybe here, and most of the people here in the talk are probably or know about fires, but most of the time when I hear and like when you see in the news, when people talk about the fire events, they talk about destruction and so on. I think like one of the important things here is that like in a big part of the ecosystems worldwide are at least partially adapted to fire. And so after fire, most of the time, okay, like there might be changes, but netto, like there might be like no impact or even a positive impact on the ecology functionality of a fire. And I mean, it's really important because like that's really the driver about like the historical and still current day policies about like a complete fire exclusion and like firefighting and no fire should be allowed in the landscape that still exist in many countries worldwide. And I think like that tends to lead really to like big disasters, as has been seen like in different areas worldwide. That doesn't mean that like there's no impact, of course, no, and like as you say, like the fire regimes, no, but like even in like the big fires, like as Owen explained, like in Australia, netto, like after these like really massive fire impact, like the study that he showed, like there was netto like a negative impact on like biodiversity as such. But if you like look into detail, where there's really like a big impact, there was in areas where there had been like pretty recently a fire. So we have like this kind of quick return of like recurrent fires. So kind of a shift in fire regime. And that's where we see like negative impacts. Or where it is like this kind of very big intense fires where we get like more at the landscape scale, this kind of homogenizations. And so I think like one of the important things is to take into account that like in most of the times, like in fact, the ecological impact can be positive or at least neutral. And in fact, like I think for many people who saw like that paper coming out like at the end of a couple of months ago from the Australian fires, I think like if you take into account like the shift in the fire regime and then the size, in fact, like there's also a lot of species who really benefit from these fires, no? And I think it's something important to point out. There's also always a lot of surprises, no? So one of the things that like we've been studying more and more are like suddenly like you have these regime shifts where you had like one ecosystem type and then suddenly you can have like a shift towards another regime, and like there's like still a lot of study into what is causing them, whether can predict them, because there we do have like a complete shift of a species turnover, and like the impact can be much faster. There's some interaction with invasive species there too. But like for me, one of the last things I want to say about this is that like the fire impact doesn't happen on its own. Like fires, like these kind of extreme fire events, almost all of them have some kind of climate change contribution to them. And climate change also has an impact on the vegetation dynamics. And so if we look to like the ecological impact of fire by itself without taking into account that like the vegetation is already being impacted or adapted to like this changing climate change, I think we're missing a bit the point that like the vegetation is not just reacting to fire, but there's also this kind of climate change impacting fires, but also directly impacting the vegetation. Then like about like this kind of global coordination, I think that's really like very important, because between different countries, I mean, one of the important things to notice is like in the end, like most decisions and most kind of policies are made at the national level, and most of the time there's not that many countries who have like a very proactive kind of attitude towards fire. Most of the time you need like extreme events for like policies to adapt, and policies tend to change very slowly. And so there's a lot of experience in some countries, while other countries are only just starting to kind of build up this kind of knowledge regarding fire management. Most of the time, like the country where I'm in, like fire is completely prohibited and all fires should be extinguished. Is kind of still a bit of policy, although they're slowly changing, while other countries like the US, but also Brazil has been developing over the last decades a very strong kind of prescribed fire policy and like efforts, and like all of these kind of experiences, both positive and negative, can really inform like other countries to kind of not make the same mistakes as other countries already have made, and learn from both like things that work well and things that didn't work well in other countries. And I think with that, I think I said enough. Thanks a lot.
That was excellent, Stijn. I appreciate your thoughts. And just as a reminder to the audience, we will open up questions for all of our speakers after we finish with these respondents. And next, we're going to be moving on to the social component. And we're going to have Dr. Susan Cutter provide some comments. And again, Susan, you are welcome to say anything that comes to mind or that you think is important. But my guiding questions for this were, what are the most important challenges of, or the most challenging impacts socially from catastrophic events? And does the vulnerability or do the impacts vary from region to region or event to event, or are there certain commonalities? And once again, is there a way that we can improve social outcomes, particularly through some kind of coordination or collaboration? And with that, I will mute myself and welcome Susan to provide thoughts.
Great. Thank you, Alex. This has been very interesting so far, which is nice to see. I'll start with the most challenging social impacts of these catastrophic events. The obvious impact is people die, people are injured, and people are displaced. And so one of the challenges is how to accommodate that and how to accommodate the desire that the people who want to return, how we can facilitate that return. And here we have a major challenge in that the residents have a desire to return quickly and reconstruct their homes. And we have the realities of reconstruction, which want to build back, but perhaps build back slower, not faster, and build back with better safety considerations and fireproofing. And what you see are some of the conflicts, particularly in Los Angeles, where you're having conversations about people want to come back and come into these areas, but because it's an urban fire, the plots of land are not suitable for rebuilding right now because they're full of toxics. And you can't allow people into these areas immediately to rebuild because of that. So one of the I think big challenges, particularly when you affect large communities, is this disconnect between the desire from affected populations to return quickly and the realities of what returning quickly really means. And quickly in this context is not weeks to months, but years. A second challenge has to do with the governance issues. And this, I think, has applications in many different places as well. And the question here and the challenge is, who controls zoning and land use in the affected area? Because the entity, whether it's the city or a county or the federal government who owns the land, they are going to dictate how to reconstruct, how large the plots of land could be, or the size of the structures. And so what you may see, and we're already starting to hear some stories in Los Angeles, is that some people recognize they're not going to be able to reconstruct their homes. The land is so valuable, particularly in the Palisades area, that people may be willing to sell their plot of land to someone who wants to rebuild in that area. And what you're going to see are an inequity showing up because only the rich can afford to buy a new plot of land or multiple plots of land to put up massive structures in an area where they want to live. And so you'll see people buying up double lots, for example. What that does is it creates the inequity of people who may have lived there for 50 years can no longer afford to rebuild. And they can't afford to rebuild because of simply not having the resources to do that. They may be on fixed incomes now or retired, but also you've got increased costs of the building materials. You've got the increased costs of insurance, if it's available. It's going to perhaps price many out of the market. And so what you are seeing, particularly in some of these wooey areas, is the people who come back are the wealthy people who come back. Because most people who, let's say, renters, for example, in apartments, they're not going to rebuild apartments in these areas because it's not efficient in terms of pricing. And so your increase in inequities in many of these catastrophic fires, particularly when they're happening in places like California. So that's one of the issues here, and I think you'll see it play out in a very large way in the LA fire in particular. Another one of the impacts that I don't think we've talked about yet is the impacts on human health from the smoke. And here, I think this is perhaps a more global issue that lends itself to coordination and collaboration across these regions. The air pollution and the effect of the particulate matter on people who may have pre-existing respiratory concerns or cardiovascular concerns is a big problem. And it creates a short-term health crisis in areas that may or may not have the capacity to effectively respond to those short-term health crises because some of those health facilities have burnt down, for example. But it also creates some longer-term problems and can disproportionately affect certain populations that are more sensitive to air pollution and creating asthmatic conditions. So I think the smoke is a large impact and one that's really understudied. And we have to think of the smoke as an impact not only in the area where the fire is occurring, but also downwind. And this is the example that we saw a couple years ago with the Canadian fires that were creating massive air pollution episodes in New York and other places. The other sort of social impact is again the livelihood alterations that take place because of the fire. And this is also, I think, a global issue insofar as livelihoods in systems that are more rural areas are going to disrupt the livelihoods of people that rely on those natural resources to begin with. In the more urban areas, what you see is the livelihoods are disrupted in places in California because people would work in the homes that are no longer there. People may have businesses that are in that area that they're not going to be able to rebuild. So you've got a whole economic issue with respect to the impacts of the fire in the loss of economic drivers in some of these places. So our lessons learned are primarily going to be related to the need to improve the capacity for resilience. And it's resilience not only in the ecosystem itself, but resilience in the social systems. And what is the plan B for people who rely on the natural resources that may burn, or people who rely on the industries and businesses that are affected by the wildfire. And I'm thinking in particular is, a lot of the restaurants, a lot of the hotels that may have been affected, lodging, tourism is another big one that I see happening. If you live in a region where your economy is largely tourism based, and having people go into some of these forested areas could be problematic. And if you lose that tourism economy in the same way that you might lose your tourist economy in a hurricane, it takes a long time for that recovery to take place. And so it's not that people can recover, that the areas burned can recover. That takes time, but it takes a much longer time for these social systems to recover and to reconstruct themselves. And I think I will stop there.
Thank you so much, Susan. You always have such fascinating perspectives, and I always learn when you talk. We are now going to move on to Dr. Mauro. Try to move the slide forward. Dr. Mauro González, and he will be talking about some of the policy and management implications. He's going to be talking a lot about what happened in Valparaíso from a Chilean perspective. And I will read the questions to you here, but he also has provided some slides in English that I will show to you because he is going to be speaking in his native language, Spanish, which I know some of us can understand, but not all of us. So I gave to Mauro, again, a set of questions to think about that he didn't have to necessarily answer specifically to. But were there policy or management actions that contributed to what happened? And are there policies and actions that we really need or that could be coordinated globally? So with that, I'm going to move on to Mauro's first slide. I welcome you all to read his response as he talks about it in Spanish. And Mauro, please just let me know when you want me to change your slide. So thank you.
Gracias, Alexandra. Varias de los factores ya han sido mencionados respecto a algunas acciones, algunas políticas de manejo que han exacerbado, que han incrementado o pudieron haber incrementado la magnitud de los impactos socioecológicos de estos incendios. Eh, Al menos hay una que probablemente es particular a la región que fue afectada, que tiene que ver con las plantaciones forestales, principalmente de eucaliptus y de pinos radiata, plantaciones que han sido abandonadas por motivos de mayor valor de esa tierra para la venta de parcelas y también que han quedado sin manejo, por lo tanto con una gran carga de combustible, lo que sin duda facilita y ha facilitado, ¿no es cierto?, la propagación de este incendio. Además de una vegetación muy seca, estresada, como mencionaba Alejandro, debido a esta sequía intensa que llevamos por varios años, y condiciones, si bien no extremas desde el punto de vista meteorológico, pero condiciones de sequía, de vientos bastante fuertes durante ese día catastrófico. Pero también se suma el aumento de las zonas de interfaz urbano-rural debido a este asentamiento humano sin regulación. Y eso en áreas que están adjuntas o dentro de áreas de vegetación bastante inflamable. Por otro lado, también tenemos la falta de regulaciones y de acciones respecto al manejo del combustible en estas áreas de interfaz. Y tendemos una ley forestal de incendios que todavía no ha sido aprobada y en la cual se incluyen justamente las acciones requeridas en las propiedades tanto públicas como privadas de manejo del combustible, especialmente las zonas de interfaz urbano-rural. Y otro aspecto importante que digamos, que tuvo de alguna manera, acrecentó este impacto en el incendio de Valparaíso del 2024, se refiere a la tardía o poco oportuna comunicación del riesgo de incendio a las distintas partes interesadas, los servicios operativos, a las autoridades que toman decisiones, a la población local, a la población afectada, para coordinar y manejar y responder a las evacuaciones respecto en el incendio. La siguiente. em, Bueno, respecto a algunas decisiones de manejo o política que serían muy necesitadas, ¿no es cierto?, para prepararse para futuros eventos, eh, sin duda están el desarrollo a nivel de las comunas, de las municipalidades, de estos planes de emergencia y también los planes de emergencia de riesgo de desastre, ya que eso de alguna forma va a mejorar el entendimiento del riesgo del desastre de incendio, la gobernanza de este riesgo, también la resiliencia, reducir la resiliencia, digamos, reducir el riesgo para aumentar la resiliencia y mejorar también la preparación, una preparación mucho más efectiva para una respuesta y la recuperación posterior. Otro aspecto también que lo consideramos clave para incendios en el futuro son estas alertas tempranas que ya se están implementando en Chile, eh, y las condiciones del riesgo, la comunicación del riesgo de desastre. Yo creo que eso es muy importante, ya que en el caso del fuego, las condiciones cambian muy rápidamente y por lo tanto las personas amenazadas también cambian. En un par de minutos puede cambiar, ¿no es cierto?, la comunidad, el área que va a ser afectada y por lo tanto la comunicación tiene que ser muy actualizada, muy precisa, de manera que las personas puedan responder de una manera rápida al incendio. Y por otro lado, también están en mejorar las regulaciones respecto al uso del suelo, y la planificación urbana, Alejandro mostraba la ciudad de Valparaíso, que prácticamente no hay una planificación, hay un asentamiento que no tiene ninguna regulación en los cerros, ¿no es cierto?, de Valparaíso, y eso sin duda aumenta el riesgo, la exposición que tiene la gente a estos incendios, que muchas veces son de pequeña superficie, pero tienen un gran impacto en vidas humanas y en infraestructura. Y por último, reducir la exposición, ¿no es cierto?, de estos paisajes que son propensos al fuego por actividades tanto de manejo, reducción de combustible, de la restauración también de la vegetación nativa y la remoción de plantaciones forestales que han sido abandonadas sin manejo, muy inflamables eh, en el área, digamos, especialmente de interfaz. Gracias, Alexandra. Y por último, bueno, este es un ejemplo muy interesante de, de un barrio que se salvó de este incendio y se salvó por razones muy concretas. La primera y la más importante es que esta comunidad local, este barrio tenía mucha conciencia de que el fuego podía afectar sus casas, ya que habían tenido incendios previos. Por lo tanto, tenían una organización, una preparación de reducir combustible, de tener áreas de interfaz sin vegetación, y fue un barrio que se salvó íntegramente, 70 casas se salvaron del incendio por estas medidas de manejo y de gestión previa de prevención del fuego. Gracias, Alexandra.
Muchas gracias. Talking about the how anticipating ahead of time that fire risk could happen for communities to prepare and become more resilient. So we are going to be moving on. This is a slide just showing some of the activities that we've got coming up with the Global Wildfire Collective throughout the rest of the year. I mentioned that we will be having a gap analysis where we'll be looking at gaps in data and resources in the Latin American Caribbean region in May. In June, we will be joining with the FAO Global Fire Management Hub, where they're going to have a session looking at data and communications, and we hope to help to lead a working group for that. Also, as I mentioned, in the fall, we will be having a training session in a country in Latin America where we will be using the information we learn from our GAP workshop to help develop some capacity and some training for a wide range of sectors. And then finally, we hope to be involved in the COP30 activities that will be coming up in November. So while we shift over to our question and answer session, which we will be having Robin Jones, the Executive Director of Conservation Biology, is going to be asking the questions as they're coming in because I cannot see them. I want to also leave this screen up, which has 3 QR codes. If you're interested in more about the Global Wildfire Collective, this one is a place where you can add your name and email address so that when we, as you know, we are in the process of launching this, so you can stay informed of what our latest activities and developments are as we put our development or our discussion forum online when we create our gateway. If you are interested in joining us in the meeting in Bogota, you are welcome to request an invitation. We would love to have you there. And finally, if you feel as if this initiative is worth funding, you are welcome to donate by clicking on this QR code. And with that, I will let Robin come in and ask questions that are coming in from you participants.
Perfect. And I'll just remind everybody that button for the Q&A is at the bottom center of your screen. So if you have questions that you want to enter and you're looking for it, it's just hover your cursor at the bottom of the screen. I'm going to start with a question that actually has been answered in text by Stijn Hantson already. But I think some of the other panelists may be able to chime in as well. So this question is asking the panelists to give some examples of how a fire regime may change over time. Why don't we start with Stijn, because you've already chimed in text.
Yeah, I try to kind of respond like like in time, but yeah, I mean, there's a lot of ways how fire regimes. I mean, the fire regime is also not something static, no, but like kind of dynamic. But overall, kind of in general, what we kind of assume happens is that like you have certain vegetation under certain conditions it can burn, and you get fire vegetation interactions. We kind of result in a vegetation that is adapted to a certain kind of characteristics of fire, both in recurrence, intensity, and so on. That like, how can it change? Well, I mean, more or less any action that like both humans or directly or indirectly take can change it. And for example, like if you suddenly have like way more ignitions under similar conditions, you will end up quite often with more burned area, so more frequent burning. If you have species that need a certain number of years to get maturity and be able to reproduce, so you get to troubles and your vegetation will change. On the other hand, like I work a lot like in tropical savannas, for example, where at a global scale, we see each time like less and less fire occurring, both directly and indirectly due to landscape fragmentation. But that means that like all the fire adapted vegetation that occurs there is now like, there's like less fire occurring. And so those species that are adapted to fire are in fact quite often struggling, and we see also shifts there in vegetation due to like a less recurrent occurrence of fire. And when it occurs, quite often it's under more extreme conditions too, which, well, sometimes the vegetation or like the ecosystem isn't adapted to.
Thank you. I see, Owen, you have your hand up as well.
Yeah, so if I could talk about Australian eucalypt forests, which are the dominant in our area. So these are pretty resilient to fire. But what we think is happening is you go from a situation where you have relatively rare fires, say every 20 years or so, of high severity. And what we're doing now with climate change is cranking up the frequency. So they're occurring more often. So that's going to mean that they have less time to recover their fuels. So there will actually be less fuel available when the next fire starts. And so you're changing the regime from one of a rare high intensity to more frequent low intensity, because they won't have the fuels to make that high intensity. So that's what we think will happen. There's not a lot of evidence that it is happening, but that's what we think is happening.
Excellent. And Jon, looks like you have a response as well.
Yeah, I think California has a good example of how fire regimes can change. For example, our conifer forest in the Sierra Nevada and further north historically had frequent fires, and they burned in the understory and on relatively frequent intervals, maybe every 10 or 20 years. And as a consequence, the fire regime was controlled by fuel availability because they had plenty of ignitions. It's an area with high lightning ignitions. And so the fire regime was one of frequent low intensity surface fires, and the control was the fuel accumulation, or you could say they were controlled by fuel availability. However, in the last century, state and federal agencies have been on a program to eliminate all fires, or at least that is a goal. And as a result, the forests have accumulated extensive fuels. So no longer are they fuel limited. They have plenty of fuels. What they're limited by, though, is fuel moisture. And so now climate plays a much bigger role in controlling the fire regime in those forests. And so we can describe them now as being climate limited fire regimes.
Very good. Very interesting. There is a related question here. What, if any, are the linkages between changing wildfire regimes and land degradation and or desertification trends? So are we seeing land degradation happen on a longer term basis after these wildfires, I think is the question. Owen. Oops, you're muted. We can't hear you.
Sorry, I'm not much of an expert on this, but our expectation is that this will happen, especially in the areas that are semi-arid already. They can't tolerate fires very frequently, so frequent fires would lead to desertification. I don't think we've got any direct evidence of that happening in Australia.
Okay, great. Jon?
California has a really good example of this. In fact, Alexandra probably should discuss it because she's done most of the research on type conversion in our shrubland landscapes. And basically what we've seen is largely due to increased human ignitions, due to population growth, we've seen more and more fires that have pushed the system beyond their level of tolerance. And as a result, we've lost many of our native shrubland vegetation. They've been replaced with mostly non-native grasses from that have dominated the landscapes. And along with that, there's every reason to believe that anthropogenic climate change is going to exacerbate this situation, not so much in affecting the fire regime itself, but in terms of affecting recovery of the native vegetation. When we get a fire, those landscapes after fire under increasing temperatures are likely to make it harder for the shrubs to recover and increase the chances that these non-native grasses will be able to dominate. Thank you.
Mauro.
Yeah, in the case of the central Chile or South Central, where we have a small fragment of native forest surrounded by a large matrix of exotic pine plantation. So those forests are very pressed by invasion of pine species. So when these forests burn, so there is a strong invasion of pine. So, and this in some way change the fire regimes. So because we have more fuel, more flammable fuels, so we expect that this area will experience a new fire sooner than before. So this is a way how native forest degradation, in this case by pine invasion, can change the fire regimes. Yeah.
Excellent, great. We only have about 5 minutes left, so if it's all right with the panelists, I'm going to move on to a couple of additional questions because there's some good ones in here and I don't want to miss them. So this is probably a question best suited for either Alexandra or Jon. Regarding the Los Angeles fires, what are the expected benefits or detriments of Governor Newsom's strategy to waive some of the environmental building standards to allow those displaced residents to rebuild more quickly?
I think that's a question best answered by Alexandra.
All right, Alex, you're on the spot.
So I think I've talked a lot about this. One of the bigger concerns we actually have in rebuilding for Los Angeles is that in California, our policy is such that when new development is constructed, it is required to be constructed up to fairly stringent wildland urban interface codes, which means that our buildings are more resilient to wildfire. They're made out of more fire-resistant materials. And also, there's a policy where you have to have a certain amount of defensible space around your property. And these are implemented in areas that the state maps as wildfire hazard severity zones. So in Los Angeles, some of the areas that had their houses destroyed were in these zones and some of them were not. And one of the concerns about the rapid rebuilding is whether or not those houses that are not in the zones are going to be built to code. And a lot of scientists, we have written a letter asking to please consider that. I believe that they probably will consider that. In terms of the ecological or the environmental consequences, I've thought about this, and I'm not sure what particularly they are, because the rebuilding I think what Susan brought up is a really good point in terms of what are the health consequences of rebuilding in areas that may have toxic chemicals remaining, but we're also rebuilding in areas that have been developed. So in other words, we're not developing into new landscapes. We are not, affecting T&E species by creating disturbed landscapes. But what are the effects to water supply, for example, from these wildfires? And I think that's probably a long enough answer. So hopefully it helped a little bit.
Susan, did you have anything you wanted to add there?
No, I think you've covered it. You do have to meet California's CEQA is much more stringent than the general Environmental Quality Acts nationally. So I wasn't quite sure how that one fit in. Clearly, the Coastal Act permitting process does, and building to code. Current code is something that happens in other places, like in hurricane areas. You have to build to the current codes for structures. So no, I think you're right on the money.
Excellent, great. Okay, I'm going to move on to the next question. In many parts of the world, rural communities do not have local firefighting agencies, so they are their own first line of defense. In your region of the world, what efforts are being made to educate members of the community in fire risk reduction? Stijn?
Yeah, I mean, I have a bit of an opinion there because I think like in practice and I mean, I already for a couple of years live in Colombia and like it's all about like firefighting. So that's like really like they tend to kind of local brigades to firefight and so on. And it's much less about like prevention or like prescribed burning is by law prohibited, so that's like not an option for the moment, like from policy perspective, but it's very much there. And I think it's also one of the things where like information or like experience from other countries can really help to kind of push this to the next level. Like Brazil has now like a pretty nice kind of prescribed fire program and so on. And so I think there's like a lot to be learned between countries and what works and what not. If not, I think like for a moment there's a lot of resources being spent on these kind of local communities, at least in Colombia, and I think they could be spent probably in a more constructive way, especially long term.
Great. And Jon, and I think we're going to make this the last answer on this because we are about to hit the end of the time frame here. So go ahead, Jon.
I think California is a good example of an area where there is a lot of focus on local communities taking an active role in fire prevention as well as fire safety. For example, there are state and federal funds that go to communities for the purpose of putting together groups of people who can do these various activities. And there's at least a half a dozen websites out there that are specifically designed for homeowners on things they can do to improve the safety of their homes and do what we refer to as home hardening, making them less resistant or more resistant to wildfires. And then there's also new products coming out. One of the ones that I heard about this week that apparently was something in the Pacific Palisades fire that's of interest is there's companies that have been developing these attic vents, which actually capture embers as they come in through the vent and prevent them from spreading fire into the attic areas. So there's developments on a lot of different fronts.
Excellent. Thank you. All right, Alex, I'm going to hand it back to you to wrap us up.
Okay. This was so awesome. Thank you so much to our speakers. You guys are amazing. I really enjoyed it, and I'm sorry we could not answer all of the questions, but I've seen a lot of really interesting and great questions come through, and I think that just speaks to the potential benefits of having a global wildfire collective. So if any of you are interested in staying informed about our activities and our initiatives, our upcoming webinars, our upcoming technologies, please let us know. We will be posting a recording of this video after today